welcome. We're back with the B Block in our podcast today. Thanks for hanging around. We have the opportunity to have a conversation with our missions director here at Venture Church, Thomas Crane. And so glad to have you here, brother. Thanks for being a part of this conversation. And so glad to sit down and have this conversation, a much needed one, I think. But before we get into the further conversation, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into missions? What are you currently doing? Tell us about your family.
Okay. When I was 12, my parents decided they were going to be missionaries in East Africa. So at 12 years old, we had been kind of bouncing around the Southeast, and the last place we had been was Virginia, where my father had pastored a church. And so we picked up from there at 12 and went to Kenya, where my parents worked with an unreached people group called the Maasai people of southern Kenya and northern Tanzania. I was in a missionary kid boarding school while I was there, so from 7th grade through high school. Graduated from college and thought that was never going to be my life. That was not my goal, was to go back to be a missionary ever. But I had seen a lot of poverty in Kenya while I was there. So I became really interested in knowing and potentially doing relief work. And that became one of my goals. So I went and got a degree in intercultural studies. But as part of that degree, they made us do an internship in a country that we hadn't been to before, or part of before, in a cross-cultural context. And I ended up getting an internship still in Kenya, but with a totally different people group. It was on the coast of Kenya, in a city called Mombasa, working with Arabs and Swahilis. And it was my first introduction to Islam. And so there I was able to, see, I conducted worldview studies and people group profiling kind of questionnaires. And so it's a lot of questions about what people believed. And as I listened to more and more Muslims just explain to me what they believed, I began to be convinced that the devil does his best work when he sticks closest to the truth. So it's not to say that, that conviction just I found Hinduism almost silly at that point. 333 million gods, some of them who have elephant heads and all this stuff. It didn't make sense to me. But what these guys were saying in these interviews of how they had heard the name of Jesus, that he was born of a virgin, that he had lived a great life, that he was a wonderful prophet, that he had done some miracles, all these things. But at the end, we would take out, but God would never kill one of his prophets like that. So we take out a bloody cross and an empty tomb. We take out the atonement. And of course, at that point, we totally lose the gospel. So they know the name of Jesus, Isa, in the Quran, but they don't believe in him or believe that he has used a substitutionary sacrifice to redeem us from our sin and our ultimate death. The gospel is lost. And so I thought, man, that's so close though. It's so close. And all the main beliefs in Islam, like pray 5 times a day, fast. If you get the chance, go to your holy land. I've been to Jerusalem. It's wonderful. I love that trip. Fasting and praying, things that are biblical. Giving to the poor, also biblical. And then even the Shahada, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasul Allah, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Well, we agree with the first part, there is no God but God. And then maybe Muhammad is not his prophet, but we at least have this belief that there is one God, right? And so I just thought, man, the devil's doing his best work when he sticks closest to the truth. And so from that point, I had a heart for Islam and went on to seminary and became convinced that while relief agencies all around the world are doing wonderful things, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with them, I became convinced that God's plan A for reaching the world is the local church and is church planting. And that's how the gospel spreads, and that's how that's the pattern of the New Testament, especially in Acts. And I became convinced that that was how I wanted to spend my life, was trying to introduce Muslims to the real Jesus and to help in church planting efforts. So that's what kind of led me towards a missions life.
Awesome. And so we're fortunate to have you to come help us be more a missions-minded church. And so Thomas is now leading a team of people, some former missionaries and some other folks in our church, to help us become more missions-minded, to help bring the world a little bit closer to us in some meaningful ways. And Thomas, I found it interesting that, part of your drive was really kind of revealing truth. Like you saw the Muslims so close to that truth. And oftentimes I think we here in the church as Christians, we might buy into our own version of just not quite there in our truth, what we think about it and how we believe it. And I see it even in your comment about, we're doing a lot of great aid work. We really are. But correlation I was trying to say there was, have we seen missions as, okay, it's aid relief. It's helping feed the poor. But you're saying that it's actually God's plan A to use the local church. And so in that way, I'm seeing the correlation that maybe that we're almost to the truth, just like the Muslims are, but we've kind of stopped. We've kind of said, okay, we're sending some food and relief and all that stuff.
Well, again, there's nothing wrong with it. And there's times in the Bible where Jesus, Paul, wants to raise money. He writes to the Romans, and he writes to other letters to raise money for the church in Jerusalem because they were struggling at that time. So one of his trips, he literally took back money to help in relief efforts for the church in Jerusalem. They were being persecuted, and they were literally without food and water and stuff like that. So he took up an offering to help out the church in Jerusalem. So absolutely zero things wrong with relief work. But when it came to how do I want to invest my life and how do I want to invest the most in kingdom work, I think that the church is God's plan A for reaching the nations. Jesus also said, though, that the poor will always be with us, right? We're always going to have the poor. So there will never be an end to relief work. There'll never be an end. But he also said, though, that once the gospel has been preached to all nations, then he'll come back. Not once you've fed everybody or you've given everybody a drink or clothed everyone that he's going to come back. But once the gospel has been preached to all nations, then he'll come back. And we have a beautiful picture of that in Revelation 5, where everyone from all people groups, tribes, tongues, and languages are worshiping around the throne. Is when and how did they get there? How did all those people groups get there in that picture that's so beautiful in Revelation 5? Did I say Romans 5 the first time? Revelation 5 is that they got there through missions, through the church planting churches in places where the church had not been planted. So even while Paul was bringing that donation, that relief effort to the church in Jerusalem, he was planning at the exact same time to go to Spain, because there was currently no church in Spain. There was no pastor. There was no church planting movement. So he had planted all over kind of Asia Minor there in Turkey and in Greece and that, but no one had been to Spain. So his goal, even while he's doing some relief work, I'm going to Jerusalem, I'm going to take them this money, this donation to help them. But his ultimate goal was not that. It was to get to Spain where the gospel had never been preached.
Yeah, and I think that's a key thing that you brought up during our budget planning meetings this year was where can we use our resources that will be most effective? And you showed us a great video that kind of broke up the world into these categories. Like there's a category that has access to the gospel and it's freely there. They have access to Bibles, almost to the point of saturation. And then there's another section of the world that maybe they have a little bit of access to it. Perhaps they, can receive the gospel through some means, but it isn't readily available as the other group. And then there's the final group that just absolutely flat out doesn't have access to it. There's not a local church anywhere near them. They don't have resources like a Bible or even the Bible translated into their language.
Yep.
And so from those meetings, I gather that we're looking to help venture focus on that group of people who don't have access, because that's where our resources can be best used.
Yeah.
Is that a fair statement?
Yes. And so, I mean, if you're listening to this and that video interests you, you want to pull up YouTube, it's by Global Frontiers Missions, and the name of the video is The State of the World. And in that State of the World, it's a whiteboard where he kind of draws a pie chart, and he kind of divides the world into 3 different groups. And then he does a good job in the video of doing definitions. So what does it mean to be a Christian? Kind of be categorized as a Christian, even if you're not. Then what does it mean that you have access to the gospel, which is the second part of the pie graph. And then the third is what it means to be unreached and unengaged. And he shows really well in the video statistically what it means to be unreached and unengaged. And then he goes on and shows how, as a Western church, where we actually send our missionaries. And you'll find that the vast majority of American missionaries don't go to unreached, unengaged people groups, but they go to either the already reached areas of the world or to areas that already have access to the gospel. And so and then it does a third thing when it goes and shows how we spend our money, and how we spend the vast majority of our money stays in the Christian world. A little bit more, a little bit less then goes to people who already have access to the gospel, and how such a very minute percentage of Christian giving, money put into the plate, actually goes to unreached and unengaged people groups. So my point in that meeting towards venture pastors and trustees was that this is where I wanted us to focus, on this part of the world. Why? Because few others are doing it, and B, because very few are spending money there. So we're not sending our people, and we're not sending our money, and so that, or not we as venture, but like the Western church,
the church as a whole, yeah,
right. So that's where I was challenging us to go. So for this year, we're still working on which is going to be Venture's long-term people group. That's a challenge. But that's something that the team this year, 2023, probably beginning of 2024, will be working on. And all of us on the team think about it all the time. And so, but for this year, we went with Sudan, and we've tried to put boots on the ground, and we've put some money on the ground through. But that's been this year's focus is Sudan, which is a very unreached and, for the most part, unengaged people group.
Yeah, in fact, the thing that kept us from putting boots on the ground was the actual this unrest, the flat out war that's going on there. Can you tell us a little about what's it like in Sudan right now?
Right. Well, Sudan is a Muslim country, and so up until 2019, it was actually run by Sharia law. So it was very hard to have any access or do any sort of outward evangelism. Different agencies, mission agencies, have sent workers to Sudan throughout the years, have tried, and it's never gone very well. People either usually get denied access or get kicked out within their first 4 or 5 years of being in the country. 2019, though, things shifted and changed a little bit within the government, and they lifted a lot of those Sharia laws, and there was more religious freedom, became a lot more prevalent. And since then, the organization that we've partnered with, which is called Calvary Road Ministries, has partnered with a number of local pastors there. And those pastors, oh my gosh, since 2019, have been able to report kind of numbers coming out of Islamic country that we literally, since Muhammad wrote the Quran in 600 AD, we haven't seen that kind of numbers coming out of Sudan, where these number of people are converting to Christianity. A lot of them, and particularly in the state of Darfur, which a lot of people have heard about over the years because it's been in the news for the last few years, especially if you followed the news in the past. This group called the Janjaweed were coming down and were just basically kind of committing genocide in Darfur. And the number of that genocide, which horrific and horrible and terrible as it was, has created I don't know the exact right words, but a heart of openness maybe, and a realization that Islam may or may not be the truth. Everything that they've been taught their whole life, if this is what it means to be a Muslim and these Janjaweed or what a good Muslim is, then maybe I don't want to have anything to do with it. And so their ears and eyes were open to hearing the gospel, and so many people since 2019 have come to faith. The plan was to go to Khartoum to do a training session. There's going to be about 25 men, about 25 women, so a total of about 50 people that we're going to bring, a lot of them from Darfur, into Khartoum to do this training session. So it's going to be how to teach the Bible to primarily oral learners, so people who can't read and write. And the weekend they were going to leave, the weekend that they were supposed to leave, a literal war broke out between the Sudanese army and a group called the Rapid Support Forces, which are basically a paramilitary group that have a lot of guns and a lot of ammunition and a lot of military equipment. And these, within Islam, even within the Western world, but within Islam, power is king. And these two groups have gone after that power to the expense of everyone else in the country. And the RSF in particular, a lot of them were Janjaweed back in the past. And they have lists of Christians. And their whole goal since when 2019, when kind of religious freedom became a little bit of a thing, man, they're there to reverse that decision. And so there are literal lists floating around with different people who've come to faith, the leaders. And so what was originally intended to be a trip with Venture members, boots on the ground, training people with Bible stories and how to teach the Bible, has now turned into more of a relief effort with helping the brothers and sisters that we do have there that are in pretty severe persecution and in pretty dire, beyond just persecution, then also dire circumstances in regards to even just food and water and basic humanitarian needs.
Yeah, that's a very difficult environment to share the gospel when people don't have their basic needs met. No one wants to sit down and talk about Jesus when they haven't eaten for 6 days.
Right.
They want something to eat. And that does become a very challenging thing. So how did we as a church and as your team kind of pivot from that boots on the ground mentality to actually creating that aid for people?
Well, we had set aside, first off, in that meeting that we talked about a little bit ago, it's a budget meeting with pastors and trustees. I just, give a lot of credit to Venture set what was a huge amount of money towards the mission budget compared to what it had been in previous years. And I mean, I was very pleased. And I thought it was very generous of, the leadership of the trustees to vote that in. And we're really excited, so a huge chunk of that money was going to go towards that initial conference, which was meant to bring these 25 women, these 25 men to that conference for discipleship purposes. Once that conference didn't kick off, the money then pivoted to how can we best meet the needs of the believers there in Sudan. So I don't know exactly when this podcast will be airing, but the previous sermon from the week that we're recording this was Galatians, I think 6:20, where Austin just talked about how we're to do good to all, but especially to those within the faith, especially right, to other believers. And so this presented an opportunity to do exactly that. So the sermon we just heard from last week is literally what we're trying to do in Sudan, because yes, they're not Venture members. They don't go to a church with a praise band and a pastor and a nice stage with microphones, but they are the church. They are our brothers and sisters. Most of them, all of them have converted out of Islam. They are now, their life is in danger, in part just because of the context they're in, but also in large part because of their faith. So many of them have been told, you need to, you can live if you recant, and have refused to do so. And a lot of these now are even just women and children, because so many of the men have either been killed or they, are in fighting, but a lot of the men have been killed. So super unfortunately, I mean, one of the a lot of this money and relief stuff is going towards helping women and children. But back to your question, we pivoted from what was meant to be a discipleship situation into assisting the local church there in multiple ways. One of which was if we could evacuate people from really dangerous circumstances, we helped to evacuate people. And then secondly, we found that once we evacuated people, they were leaving their home, they were leaving the towns that they knew because they were super dangerous, but now they're going to areas and places where they literally have nothing, and in some cases it's really hard to get anything. And by have stuff, I mean basic humanitarian needs: food, water, clothing, the basics. So a good chunk of the money has also went transporting people to safer places, feeding and water supply. And then thirdly, we've been doing our best to try and stay in constant communication with the leadership, who's able to pull all these people together and try and stay in contact with people. So we've literally paid some cell phone bills to try and keep those lines of communication open with these leaders so that we can get stories about what are the needs, how can we help, and the needs have not stopped. Even now, I mean, we've got a group of 60 people that are currently in a city that's really dangerous, that we would like to transport them to a city that is less dangerous. It's about $100 per person for that kind of transportation. So those kind of needs are still ongoing, even beyond what we've already given. Those needs are still there. And then we've gotten a lot of word from those local leaders that to feed a family for a month in some of these towns that they're in, it's only about $150. I mean, I spend $150 almost a week at the grocery store here for me and my family of 4.
Oh, yes.
But I can't imagine. So $150 goes a lot longer way in Sudan than it is at my local grocery store. But the blessing that you get to have there is that, so now we've relocated these people. Hopefully they're safer in this new town, and then to try and keep them alive there with just basic needs like food and water.
That's awesome. And so you'll be able to go to daretoventure.org and check out a blog post about this, where all these things that Venture has been doing with Sudan and the work there will be listed out for you. So beyond just listening to us today on this podcast, you can also check that out on daretoventure.org. And this podcast will actually air this week, so it will be really connected with...
Fresh on your minds.
Yeah, it will be connected with what Austin was preaching from Galatians 6 and challenging us to prioritize this. And I know as our missions director, if you could snap your fingers, you would want the entire church to have this as a priority, like front line. You know, there's people dying. There are people that aren't hearing the gospel. There's no access to it. And so, if we could flip the switch and everyone at Venture just be 100% with that goal in mind, you'd probably love that, right? Sure.
I mean, I'd love it if we weren't in this situation even at all.
Yeah.
I'd love it if we had gone and been able to do that training back in, was it April, and not even be having this conversation. It would be a very different conversation. I would like it if the two ladies who were supposed to have gone on the trip were sitting here telling you about how wonderful the trip was, and they were telling you the stories about how many people have come to faith and how their teaching the stories was so well received, and they were going to take it back and they're going to reproduce it in their local churches, and that would be the ideal situation.
Sure.
So I'm even sad that we're having this conversation, but I mean, I do want to highlight it, and I do want to bring it to people's mind, the forefront of our mind. I mentioned that I grew up in Kenya in the 90s, and one thing that happened in East Africa in the 90s was the genocide in Rwanda. So there's a clip, they made a movie, it's called Hotel Rwanda. Don Cheadle's the main character. He kind of runs this hotel, and there's this part where a journalist is there, and it's actually played by Joaquin Phoenix. And Don Cheadle goes up to him in the hotel, and he thanks him for being there and thanks him for telling the story. And he says to him, and I'm not going to quote it exactly right, but basically, do you think this will, now people will come and help us, right? Like this, they're going to see, they're going to hear what you've said, and you're going to tell them, report what you've seen, and now they'll help us, right? And Joaquin Phoenix, he kind of hangs his head sort of in shame, and he just says, man, I think people are going to watch this on TV, and they're going to say, God, isn't that sad? Isn't that terrible? and they're going to go right back to eating their dinner, and they're never going to do anything. And then you get to see Don Cheadle kind of walk away just absolutely dejected and just thinking like, what, you know. Yeah. And I remember as having, knowing people that went through the genocide there in Rwanda and everything like that's exactly what happened. You know, Joaquin Phoenix's character is absolutely right. And so I don't want that to be our story. Like, I don't want that to be the case here. And so we want to not only highlight it for venture people, but we want to tell you what you are already doing, what you have already done in some part to helping with this initial relief efforts. But like, don't let that be our story where we just hear this podcast and think like, God, that sounds terrible. That's awful. And then just never think about it again. And so there are other, continual needs and continual ways that we can help meet those needs through, these different relief efforts that we have going on.
Yeah. I would recommend watching that Hotel Rwanda. I actually watched that scene earlier today, and beyond just the dialogue, the acting of it. When Joaquin Phoenix character says, we'll say, wow, that's terrible, and then we'll go back to eating. You get the sense from his acting that he's actually embarrassed to say that. He knows it's true. Like, he's not going to pull any punches, but there's this sense of, I hate that it's that way.
Yeah.
I'm embarrassed that this is going to be the reaction. And then Don Cheadle's character almost has this dawning realization that this isn't going to get better. Help is not coming. And it's really a heartbreaking little vignette of a piece there where there's some words exchanged, but the emotion that's behind that and the realization that's going on is much more powerful. And so the last part of our conversation here before we wrap up the podcast is how do we get past that point of saying, oh man, that's terrible, and then it's going back to eating our dinner?
Well, you can already see it playing out even in our culture, because months ago when the war initially broke out, I had friends, venture members that should have been on a plane the following days to leave to go on that trip. And I was initially, relieved that they actually didn't leave. And then we were spending a lot more money to get them out. But then also that for days I saw it on BBC. I saw it on Sky News. I saw it on, which are British channels, because the British do better about covering world news than American news. But it might have made CNN for a second. Fox might have carried for about half a minute. And then there's a few other American news outlets that you could see it on. And you could for like the first few weeks. But honestly, I've still watched the news and have not seen it since. So from just our own culture, a Western perspective, we've already have forgotten about it. But it's an ongoing conflict that's going to turn into it is already one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the world. It gets bumped out of the news because of the conflict in Ukraine, which again, we don't want to minimize the war in Ukraine at all, but it gets bumped out because that's more of a Western culture, whereas this is more of a African, Middle Eastern, Islamic culture. And so we just think, well, to some degree, we care more about Ukraine because it's Europe somehow. And I don't know how, but we do. And Sudan's not in the news. But that's not, I want to be, one of my goals when I moved overseas to the Middle East was that, I wanted to be on the tip of the spear, the edge of the sword when it came to what are other people not doing and how can we go there. There's a famous illustration about you're walking through the woods and you see 10 guys trying to move a log. There's 9 guys on one end and there's 1 guy on the other. Who are you going to go help? And so for the world up to this point, and at least in these 2 humanitarian crises, we've all gone to help the 9. We've gone to Ukraine, we've gone to, or in the example of the video, which we talked about earlier, the state of the world, when we categorize people in, Christians or at least reached areas of the world and unreached, we go to the Christian sections of the world or we go to the reached sections of the world, but we leave the one to go to the unreached. And I just didn't want that to be my story. And while I'm driving the missions team, I don't want it to be Venture's story either. So I want to A, just highlight Sudan, but B, I want to be on the edge of the sword, and Sudan is. It is. It has been in the grasps of Islam for centuries and centuries. And here, just in the last few years, the gospel has put its foot in the door, and people have come to faith like never before. And you know what? The devil hates that. He absolutely, absolutely hates that. And I'm sure there's all sorts of reasons for why there's a war going on in Sudan right now. But I would bet behind the whole thing, at the end of the day, is just Satan being like, I've got a lockdown here. And so to just be like, well, isn't that sad? And go back to eating is just to lose, is to walk away from the first breakthrough of, evangelical Christianity in a dark Islamic country in centuries. We can't just turn our face, just go back to eating when we have brothers and sisters in Christ who are running for their lives in large part because of their faith in Christ, and who have needs $150 a month to feed their family that you and I and venture partners can't easily meet. We can't easily meet. So I just that's not what I want to be, how I want our story to go. I want us to be the ones who reach into the dark places of the world, to the unreached, unengaged people groups of the world, which, even though, I keep talking about the number of people that have come to faith, but you got to still realize that there's about 48 million people in Sudan, and 0.6% of them would identify as Christian. Okay, 0.6. So we're way below that 2% that you could maybe qualify a people group as, engaged or, reached, but we're way below that. So when I say people have come to faith, we're talking in the hundreds, not like in the thousands and thousands and thousands. Okay. So don't just think like there's a massive movement, but it is something. It is very much something. And it's something that, like I said, since Muhammad wrote the Quran in 680, we have not seen anything like it. So to now, in the middle of just massive persecution, turn our backs, I think would be tragic on our part.
Yeah, it would absolutely be tragic, and it sort of once again echoes Austin's challenge to us to prioritize this. So I have a couple of things I want to throw at you and get your thoughts about maybe why we're seeing and experiencing this apathy in the church in the West. One of those being just the proliferation of technology. We have all this information and data at our hands all the time, images from overseas. This tragic thing has happened. 4 people have died here. This flood happened over here. And it just seems like we're inundated with all this information and stories that then are tied to these opinions and people driving certain maybe political agendas or just driving whatever it is and attaching an opinion to it, which then forces us or makes us feel anyway that we have to respond in certain ways. And maybe have we just reached a limit where there's just so much that we've just given up, we just don't care? Maybe.
On a positive that I'm appreciative of technology is that we are able to, through cell phones, communicate with these guys on the ground and get so much real life like data, what's going on, stories of people, needs that need to be met, stories of people that are living, that are still alive, that are making it. Like we've got to hear a lot of success stories. There's been, one story was 30 some people that have come to faith. We would have never heard about that over the last few days if without technology. They would be lost to us totally. We've also been able to transfer money through that technology. So we've been able to meet people's literal food and beverage needs through just transfer of money through cell phones, which is wild. But on the other hand, as a bigger problem in culture, I think when we're just hearing so much bad stuff from around the world all the time, it really does something to our hearts where we can get overwhelmed. There's so much evil, there's so much bad going on, there's so much, and we can sort of become and isolate ourselves from all of it and just kind of get back into our culture and our town and within our family, within our little friend group, and it's so overwhelming out there, all the bad news all the time, that we just kind of shrink within ourselves and within our little clans. And I don't think that is a very good Christian response when our primary command from Christ at the end of each gospel and at the beginning of Acts, and then the example that we have in Acts is that go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. Like, our command is to go, is to be aware, is to be witnesses from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Like, that is what we are called to do as Christians. And when we isolate ourselves and when we hide in our bunkers, we, are disobeying the biblical commands of Christ to, go out and make disciples. And so I would hate that to be our story. One of the things I don't like about the media is the way sometimes they portray Islam, for instance. There's a country song written by Alan Jackson, and where he says, "It's where I come from, sort of front porch sitting. Where I come from, sort of fried chicken, eating fried." I'm not getting this right, and your country music fans and are just like, "Oh my God, this guy's an idiot." But the one part in that chorus, it goes, "And we're working hard to get to heaven, where I come from." And I just thought, as I had come back to the States from living within Islam in the Middle East for years, that was one of the things I noticed about a lot of Americans, that Alan Jackson was right, that Americans were working hard to get to heaven where he came from, at least down here in the South, at least in this right. Bible Belt, maybe not everywhere else, but around here, people were working hard to get to heaven. And, that song by Alan Jackson could be sung by most Muslims. They're working hard to get to heaven too. They hear exactly what they are working hard. They're praying, fasting, alms to the poor. They're doing a lot of stuff so that God will love them. And I just think, but for the grace of God and but for the gospel, that's us. So this whole thing, we should be fearful and we should be scared of them. We're just, it's the land of the free and the home of the scared. And I just don't think that should be the perspective that we have of Islam and of that part of the world. It should be more but for the grace of God, there go I, is, I think, a lot better response, because we were privileged to be born into this culture and into this country and to have been presented with the gospel at such early ages that we have been able to respond to it. But when we say unreached and unengaged, what we mean is those are people that could, in Sudan or in these different unreached, unengaged parts of the world, that could literally walk. We could drop them off of a plane and they could walk for days, weeks, and months and never meet a Christian, never see a Bible, and never walk into a church. You could have people be raised in these cities and in these countries that could get all the way to adulthood and never have met a Christian, read a Bible, or been presented with a Bible, or been to a church. And that's something that we can't even fathom here. So we're always here well, I don't understand why this guy's trying to give money to go to Sudan. But you know how bad inflation is right here? And there's so many lost people at my work, at my job, at my school, in my gym. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But those people at your work and on your campus and at your gym, they have access to the gospel because they have access to you. So they have access to the gospel. What I'm pounding the pavement here about is access and doing a better job of giving our time and money and resources to people groups, and in this case for this year for Venture Sudan, which has no or very, very minimal access to the gospel. People can literally never see a church, Bible, or Christian there in their whole lifetime, and that's something that I think is unacceptable.
Totally agree that that's unacceptable. And my second thought as we wrap up is perhaps, as you talked about doing your cultural profiles and belief profiles in Kenya, I wonder if we looked at our own culture and maybe even we take it a little bit closer to home and here at Venture, are we believing these two things? One, that Jesus Christ is Lord, that when he gave that great command that you just referenced, that wasn't ambiguous, kind of like if you want to, if you feel like it. He's actually the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, who giving us a command to go do this. Do you think we just maybe have in our belief system, we just have something there that says, well, he's really not Lord, and so thus I don't really have to engage with that command?
Yeah, there's definitely, especially here in the South, probably not in, Seattle and Boston and New York and San Francisco, but we definitely have an easy believism here where we can, it's easy to put on a cultural Christian face, especially on Sundays, and then never really talk about it again during the week, or never really think much about it or care. But that is, for instance, since we're kind of focusing on Sudan here, that is not the case for these believers in Sudan right now. They're literally being persecuted for their faith. There's lists of Christians circulating amongst these RSF forces that are literally trying to hunt them down and kill them because of their faith. Like, there's no easy believism. There's no cultural Christianity in Sudan right now. These are people that are literally on a list because of their faith in Christ. So you can't, it's culturally two very different things. And so Jesus is Lord in their life 100%, and they're being slaughtered for it. And in ours, it's kind of like, I just want to go back to dinner. Like, I just want to go, I have dinner waiting for me. And so we if we're going to take it seriously, that's why I'm not only pounding the pavement for Sudan, but for the unreached and unengaged. Because the people groups, so there's about 6,000 people groups that are still considered unreached, unengaged. Of the 7 billion people on Earth, there's about 6,000 people groups still unreached. And guess what? All of them are hard. They're still unreached and they're still unengaged because they're really hard. They're really hard to get to, like culturally, linguistically, persecution-wise, for a number of different reasons. All the easy people groups got taken. They're already crossed off of the Joshua Project list. Right. These guys are left because it's hard. And we're not going to make a dent in that if we have an easy believism, if it's a cultural Christianity, if we don't truly believe that Jesus is who he says he is, that he has he has redeemed us from sin and death. And if he's not that God, if he's not that guy, then it's not worth going. But if he is, oh my gosh, like, how can you not? How much do you have to hate someone to see a bus headed straight at him and not scream, get out of the way, there's a way of escape, there's a way to get out of this? Like, how much do you have to hate him to let the bus hit him? And so while we have a chance to play a role in that, like, let's play a role, and don't let easy believism or cultural Christianity be our story.
Absolutely. And that's, in the name of our church, is to not be apathetic. It's to dare to venture. And so I hope this conversation helps you as the listener really start engaging with your faith and believing that God has called you to be a part of world missions. It may not be to travel overseas. It may not be to, translate the Bible, but he has called you to be a part of it. And where you're planted at right now, just like Thomas said, you might be the only access for the people at your job to know the gospel, at your school. And so that's our challenge to you today, is to listen to this podcast, to read the blog at dareadventure.org, and to consider how you might be a part of world missions here at Venture. There is a great, great need that Christ is calling us to, and we don't need to feel as if we have to come up with the resources and the plan to make it happen. The gospel has a power in and of itself to create the result that God intends. And I think that's the second thing that I wanted to mention in our conversation, is so often when we hear all this bad news, we do honestly ask, well, how can I fix any of it? Like, I don't have the power, the resources, the ability, the time to engage with it. And that's where our belief really has to turn to the power of the gospel, that God has created a way out of all of this. He has a plan to redeem all things and to bring us all around his throne, like in Revelations 5, where every tongue, tribe, nation will be represented. And so we as a people at Venture need to lean into the power of the gospel and what God has called us to do in that, and trust him for the outcome of it. You'll read it in the blog that Betsy Dellinger put to there that the details aren't so much the concern as the outcome for God. It's up to him for the outcome. The details, the obedience to follow him, that's where we come into it. And so as we leave off, I just want to mention that you can look into the description of this podcast for links to the video that Thomas mentioned, as well as links to Calvary Road Ministries and to daretoventure.org, so you can get more information about what's going on with Venture and missions.
Let me do one little plug. Yeah. Starting this fall, I'm not out the dates. Dan will get you the dates in the upcoming, but we're going to have a whole missions class. We're going to start, I think we're going to call it something, we might kick this around, but something like the mission of God, and where if, any of these topics, or from Islam to just the biblical basis for missions to medical missions to all these kind of different aspects of missions, if any of that is, God's speaking to you about it, God's put a soft spot in your heart for it, we are here to help to equip and to educate you. That's why this team exists, is to disciple Venture members towards a life that is on mission with God. And so one of those ways will be this class this fall, and you can email us at missions@daretoventure.org. And it bounces to my personal email. But missions@daretoventure.org, and we can reach out to us, and as a team, we're here for you. That's why we exist, is to educate and equip you. And so any way that we can play that role for you, please let us know.
Absolutely. And we're so thankful for you, Thomas, for leading that team and to help us become a missions-minded church at Venture. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.